I start out by saying why people are taking it for granted that 1 times 1 equals 1 and are missing the big picture. So when looking at 1 times 1, it seems so simple, but also kind of confusing by its nature. Now some people might say, how can you say it's confusing? It's like the most simple thing in the world. But that's what I'm going to show here. The only reason it's so simple is because you're assuming a system that's already in place. So if you don't know what any other operation is, like 4 times 2, if you had no idea what 4 times 2 equaled, or 4 times 1, 1 times 1, it would almost seem like a contradiction, because if you don't have that former grounding of what 4 times 1 or 5 times 1 or 4 times 2 is, it kind of seems confusing because it's so simple. So then what you can do to try to figure out what times 1 equals is you can break it down to several ways of conceiving it. And the easiest way to say it is 1 times 1, what is it saying? It means I have 1. If you just say I have 1, it's really still not helping you in defining what 1 times 1 is. Also, why are you even saying 1 twice if 1 times 1 is to possess one single 1, otherwise known as 1. So another way you can define it is to do what I do, and I define it by calling 1 times 1 a scaling operation defined by groups. So 1 times 1 then becomes one group of 1, similar to 1, but it's now called one group of 1. So one group of 1 is 1, but that still kind of only makes sense because you know how to find the grouping operation. To be good philosophers, we have to be able to form stuff from the ground up. We can't rely on prior conception of how 4 times 2 works in order to define 1 times 1. We have to start with 1 times 1 and define why that defines what 4 times 2 is, you see. So when we do that, when we use 1 times 1 to define what 4 times 2 is, what we'll see is that it actually yields some very interesting conceptions. It basically says something can exist in conception and still be separate from the original 1. Okay? Otherwise, we lose all meaning of the operation of multiplication. So now I'll go on and explain why we lose all meaning if we don't realize that something can exist in conception and still be separate from that original 1. Okay, so in 1 times 1, the 1 is the particular thing we are speaking of. In the group, if we're going with the grouping operation method, the group is a mental conception, which in this case, with multiplication, is also represented by that very thing. It's not the thing itself, but the conceptual group. This is because in all scaling operations, the group is actually the things themselves. So although 1 times 1 doesn't do anything numerically, it just gives you 1. It does everything logically because it lays the foundation for establishing the value of 1. 1 times 1 is establishing the value of 1. This value is established by representing it conceptually. Isn't that interesting? So one group of 1, the group exists only in conception and is represented by the form itself. So to extend this to a pomegranate, my 1 is the pomegranate. My group is also the pomegranate, but the group is distinct from the pomegranate at the same time. Without that distinction, you cannot move on and articulate 2 times 2 correctly or logically. Otherwise, 2 times 2 would be 2. Why is this? It is because the mental distinction is what allows for the performance of the operation of multiplication in the first place. In other words, if 1 times 1 was truly just 1 equals 1, or a bare 1 and nothing else, nothing would scale or increase. Hence I said you need the mental conception of a group to make sense of math. If you want to start with 1 and not just say, this is all defined axiomatically, so it's all defined with axioms, so we don't need groups, everything is defined by the inverse to prove how the operation works. That may be true now that we have knowledge in a closed system, but my argument is that's still circular. It's not building from the ground up, it's simply assuming. This is why some mathematicians use 1 times 1 as the basic operation to ground the mathematics. So now I've been talking about 1 times 1 and applying it to the Trinity and to God. So how is God like 1 times 1? When I say God is like 1 times 1, I'm speaking about God and the Word. With the Holy Spirit, then it just becomes 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. This represents God's actions in time, not God himself. However, it can be extended to the Trinity being coherent because of the distinctness between the group and the form itself. Like in 1 times 1, God and his Word carries over perfectly, the one and the conceptional one. Therefore, because 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1, you can no longer claim the Trinity is incoherent because it's 3 persons in one God. It can easily be shown to be logically coherent with 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. The only way then to continue to reject the Trinity and say it is incoherent is to claim 1 times 1 is just 1, not 1 1. As we've already said, and I've already showed, you just lost the meaning of multiplication completely if you do that. 1 times 1 could also be said to show being, a being combined with itself does not fracture, multiply, or diminish. Okay? That is actually less obvious than we realize if you think about it, because it's a claim about reality. Now we're breaking down how this all relates to reality. Okay? So if reality were different, 1 times 1 could equal 2. Identity duplicates itself. Or 0, identity annihilates itself. Or 0.5, identity degrades under interaction with itself. But it doesn't. Identity is stable as long as the multiplication itself remains a conceptual scaling. If 1 were not equal to itself, then cause wouldn't equal effect. Truth couldn't remain true. Logic wouldn't work. A thing couldn't persist through time. 1 has no internal conflict or instability in itself. So what ends up happening is 1 is not invented, it's discovered in life, while at the same time being represented by yourself and all of nature in relation to you. In other words, because all things are coherent within themselves, all of creation can endure and form the basis of reality. Okay, so now let's get into the 0. Why you can't start with 0. So really interestingly, if you look into it, modern math starts with 0 and defines 1 as the successor of 0. So Peano, Giuseppe Peano, he's the one who did this. He we use his axioms to define mathematics today, and he defines math starting with 0 and defines 1 as the successor of 0. Really interestingly, as I'm going to mention here in a little bit, Peano actually started out with 1 being the start, and that all other numbers worth a successor of 1. So it's not a logical necessity that we start with 0. But anyway, so 0, they claim, is a foundational object. They say 0 is defined as a natural number that is not the successor of any other number. So that's why they want to start with it, because they claim it's not the successor of any other number. However, they immediately undercut 0 as a natural number because they claim it's not nothing, it's an empty set or an empty box. That's kind of nonsense, actually, because it's the same thing, essentially. Also, the concept of 0 has to mean nothing. By claiming it's not nothing, it's an empty box, we don't solve the issue. Simply claiming it's not nothing, it's a natural number who has no successor, so it must be the best place to start, it simply doesn't make sense. Okay, you can have other reasons for starting with 0, with simpler reasons, like because it makes making the axioms easier, it makes composing axioms easier. But if we try to claim that it's truly the best place to start logically, it just doesn't make sense. Okay, so if we speak of the idea of what a number truly is, it's just a symbol to represent how many things or apples we have. In other words, Peano's axioms, it's just saying you have nothing, you have no apples, just an empty box, but then you get something, you get 1 apple, you get 1. The issue is this: in order for 1 to be a successor, it must imply addition, because 0 itself has no value. So that's another thing. They say that with the successor system, they're not assuming addition, which they are. So claiming it's an empty box, it's not nothingness, accomplishes nothing to solve this issue. So you can't define 1 as the successor of 0 without smuggling in addition, because 0 can only be reached mathematically by the loss of 1. You can't reach 0 any other way, and trying to make it a starting point because it supposedly doesn't have a successor doesn't change the fact that 0 only exists as a mental conception in relation to loss. Or I guess you could say gain if you were starting with -1. So 0 really only is a mental conception of negatives. It's only a mental conception of subtraction. So this is the claim that they make, another claim that they make in Peano's axiom. They say, to define natural numbers, we need a starting point that isn't defined by another number. Okay, well 1. 1 is perfect for that. 1 is not defined by another number. It's completely coherent within itself. 0, on the other hand, is defined only in relation to 1, because nothing is nothing. All right? In reality, 0 is the loss of 1. Claiming but empty box doesn't change that. Okay? So the Peano axioms define 0 as a natural number that's not a successor of any other number. If we started with 1, they claim we would have to ask, what is 1? They claim that defining 1 as the base case is more arbitrary than starting with nothing. Okay? So they claim nothing is less arbitrary than starting with 1. Okay. Why is defining 1 as the base case more arbitrary than starting with nothing? That's what we have to ask. Because that seems absurd to claim, but that is what they claim. See, I argue 1 is much cleaner of a number to start with, and truthfully, the only number you can start with, because 1 can be described as you, yourself. You are 1. That's clean, okay? And the thing is it's not circular, because knowledge of yourself is the one thing that is not circular. But this is what I get into, how they tried to disconnect math from all subjects, from all objects. And when you do that, math literally loses all meaning. It might work on a calculator, but it has no real meaning then if you disconnect it from all conception of objects. Really, you can't do it, okay? And they don't do it, as I'm going to show here in a little bit. So, you yourself are one. That's what we start with. If we have to ask what is one, we say one can be described as you yourself. You are one. And then you can extend that to any other person, place, or thing. So the reason that's so great is because the one thing that is not circular is knowledge of yourself. However, the response the zero advocates, I call them the zero bros, have to this is not even kidding. They say that knowledge of yourself is subjective. And the empty set, the zero, provides a more universal starting point than human consciousness. So, some more arguments of the zero bros. The definitions in Peano's Axioms, they claim, are not circular because they're based on a hierarchical construction. So they say it's all based on hierarchy, so it's not circular. Which, obviously, that's assuming a system, but let's get into it. So the axiom, they claim, is the empty set, the empty box exists. Definition of zero is zero equals empty set. Definition of one equals successor of zero. Definition of two equals successor of one. So this is what I'm talking about when they say it's a hierarchy. So the supposed claim then of the zero bros is that by using the empty set as the foundational building block, modern math avoids defining one in terms of itself. So, in other words, they're saying, because we're not saying one is one, being completely circular, well, what is one? It's one. They try to avoid doing that, so they have this conception that having a successor system somehow solves that. So, they claim that by using the empty set as the foundational block, modern math avoids defining one in terms of itself, avoids being circular. So the big glaring issue, though, is if Peano's axioms use zero and define one as the successor of zero to supposedly avoid circularity, then they really haven't done anything, because claiming it's not circular because it's hierarchical is arbitrary. It assumes a set system in place. Trying to define math without philosophy is refusing to admit that it's a circle, it's circularity. If you try to define math and just completely disconnect it from philosophy. So, obviously they don't claim that math is completely disconnected from philosophy, but the reason I'm saying that is because they wanted to disconnect it from all subjects, all objects. But if you do that, you still have circularity, and you're just refusing to admit it. So in other words, saying it's hierarchical, therefore not circular, it's begging the question, because it assumes a set system in place. This is why I say it's better defined as axiom. The one exists. One equals you, yourself. This is not circular because we are not defining one as one or itself. We are defining it as a person. You, yourself, you equals one. This is the one thing that is not circular, because knowledge of yourself is the one thing that can never be circular. It truly is axiomatic. So the argument for circularity in Peano's axioms. This is my argument for the circularity in Peano's axioms. Begging the question. So if you define 1 as successor of 0, 2 as the successor of 1, so on and so forth, you're defining numbers based on their position in a sequence. You are asking what is 1 and answering the next thing after 0. This presents a circularity problem because to understand successor, you implicitly need to understand after or next. To define after, you rely on an implicit understanding of the order of 0, 1, 2. Okay? So in the end, the critique holds that attempting to build math purely from axioms without philosophy, without subjects, without objects, often mass circular definitions behind a hierarchy of formal symbols, failing to truly define what a number is in an absolute sense. So philosophy and math will forever be intertwined. Math is ultimately based off logic, which means you need philosophical descriptions like one as you yourself, if you truly want to avoid circularity. Otherwise, you're just question begging. The only possible defense to this is that Peano's axioms are not trying to define numbers, but to claim how they behave. But right now, that just undercuts everything they were saying before about it being foundational and not constructive. They now go on and say, oh, we're not trying to define numbers, but claim how they behave. So right there, obviously, claiming how they behave is more smuggling in of concepts and contradicts the former idea that the axioms are foundational, not constructive, because behavior implies operations. If the axioms don't explain what numbers are but how they behave, it smuggles in addition and subtraction, which is a big no-no when formulating math theory. In the end, the circularity is basically admitted to some extent in this debate, as 0 and the successor function are taken as undefined starting concepts. So claiming, by claiming that, oh, it's an undefined starting concept, if they say undefined, yes, they try to make it look non-circular when it is actually circular. So by saying that it has starting concepts, they're immediately admitting it's circular. So the successor function automatically has that issue. The worst part is it doesn't just assume starting concepts, okay? But the successor concept, which really in the end only says 2 comes after 3, etc., is not a non-circular starting point. It already is relying on what's already known, like concepts of 1, 2, 3, etc. This gets into why if you try to start with 0, you cannot get a system that works unless a system already exists that is built upon 1 anyway. So that's the funny thing. Without having a system that's already in place, it's already built upon 1, you can't even try to start a new system and redefine it by starting with 0. So in the end, Peano should have went with 1, and he was gonna start with 1, but then was oddly persuaded to start with 0 instead of 1 later on. And I noticed it's interesting that Peano was actually a Freemason, and he was highly influenced by people, whole rationalist modern logic mindset, which is, I'm going to get into more of this about the assuming something from nothing, the problems with that, and how it's so obvious that that's what they're saying in the modern academic sphere. So here's the thing. You cannot build presence out of absence without already assuming presence. So any system that says we begin with 0, what is actually saying is we begin with nothing and pretend something appears. That's not math, and it's not reality. Also, this idea that people have, in the debate between creation and evolution, or the formation of the universe and stuff, this idea that people have that 0 can collapse and become 1, somehow, that the idea that 0 can just collapse and become 1 it's basically the ramblings of a madman, okay? So saying 0 can collapse and become 1, that's different than saying one exists and another one can exist in conception alongside it without changing the reality of that one. So the difference is God's conception, if we're thinking of God now in creation, it's all powerful. So if we're talking about God's word, it creates reality, it's not just plainly an abstract thought like a human. So more problems with starting with zero. You cannot start with zero and proclaim one as the successor of zero, because it simply doesn't work for several reasons. Number one, who says number zero? At that point, we might as well call it -1 as our first point. Because if you don't make 1 the first point, it's not even a point at all. Peano might claim it's the piece of paper you're writing on, but that already presupposes a domain in which absence can be treated as an object. Okay? And it already presupposes a hierarchy where something can be prior to unity. Okay? That is a metaphysical choice. It's not a logical necessity. You don't need to start with zero. So Peano does not justify why zero should exist at all. These axioms, it just asserts it. So Peano's successor function assumes ordering. It assumes descendancy. And if they go ahead and claim we're not actually smuggling in addition, that's being philosophically evasive, because the successor idea is proto-addition. It's basically addition in a prototype form. So also concerning the origin of life or the universe, I would say zero doesn't act like a foundation or something that can be a neutral starting point. Okay? This is because in any operation with zero, it either does nothing, like 4 plus 0, or is the loss of something, like 4 times 0. It can't give rise to another form of something or something itself unless that something is already existing. Hence, it could be said 1 is ontologically prior to 0. So this is what I was talking about before when I said 0 can only be reached by subtraction. Okay? Hence, 1 is ontologically prior to 0. So this is because 1 does not depend on anything else in order to have meaning in and of itself. If one thing exists, then one truth holds. Only after one thing exists can you say there could have been nothing. It could be removed. It can go missing. However, you cannot claim that by losing something or doing nothing, you can derive that same thing. Okay? This is because 0 works differently than 1. It doesn't have the same meaning within itself because 0 doesn't exist. 0 literally depends on 1 in order to have any meaning. Another way to describe this is modern formalists. They like to say that we can define numbers however we want. Now that might be true for math in a closed system, but the issue is this creates a philosophical blunder in your thinking. That philosophical blunder is the biggest error with 0 is that it forgets that being is not optional. Although you can, if you want, change the meaning of symbols, you can't redefine why coherence exists at all without producing incoherence. When you start with 1, everything flows naturally. Nothing is arbitrary. When you start with 0, you have to invent anchors later and hand wave everything. In other words, you end up needing to use later knowledge already gained in order to define the starting point of your system. That fails logically and produces absurdities because 0, as I've already said, either does nothing or is the loss of something. It can't give rise to something else and depends on one in order to have any meaning at all. One is self-grounding. Zero is context-dependent. Being is primary. Non-being is derivative. So, I would now like to posit that moving away from one in favor of zero was a philosophical choice. This is because Peano did originally lean more heavily on one in earlier formulations, as I said before. The shift toward zero and set theory framing came later, and that was largely under the influence of mathematicians slash logic slash philosophers, I guess you could say, logicians like Dedekind. Yeah, the famous Dedekind or Frege. Those were some of the two most important guys that influenced Peano to move from using one as his base case to zero. So actually, it was a philosophical turn, though, when he did that. It wasn't purely based on logic or logically necessary. Interestingly, Frege explicitly rejected grounding number in consciousness or selfhood. So he directly rejected the idea that I put forth, that one is you, yourself, you are one. Now, although rationalists like Dedekind or Frege might have supposed good reasoning to disconnect numbers from subjects or objects, perhaps it almost may have seemed noble in a way, so that math is not fettered down by metaphysical concepts. It's just, the problem is, it just ultimately becomes nonsense in an assumed system then. Because if you don't ground it in an object and try to ground math into something that is not a person, place, or thing, you can't do it, really. Even a concept is a thing. So the idea then that something can come from nothing, perhaps in math it could be argued as sort of silly to worry about. You know, like, why is this such a big deal if we start with zero instead of one? It's just math. That's true. But to me, it's actually key evidence that they decided, these famous minds like Dedekind and Frege and Peano decided to start with zero instead of one and make one the successor of zero. To me, that's actually evidence of a greater pattern at work. The pattern is this: the rationalist idea of obsession with formal symbols that drive, it's a drive to eliminate intuition. Okay? It's an ambition to supposedly purify arithmetic. However, the issue is you don't get thinkers that way. You get people who follow commands that you give them, the axioms. So this alignment with Dedekind Frege style rationalism is what ultimately gives way to the more modern idea that nothing comes before something, which is apparently even built, as I've been showing through Peano's axioms, into our very mathematical axioms. So the modern academics teach us contradictions. That's what I would say. How so? They say nothing comes before something. Evolution is one example of that. The Big Bang. Even numbers themselves, apparently. However, they will simultaneously be forced to admit that nothing obviously can't come before something. So they will admit that without having to come out and say it. What that translates to is, we don't know what comes before the Big Bang. We can only tell you how stuff operates after it starts. Evolution says all biological life evolved from a being of primitive form, yet we have no idea how this first being could have evolved. The funny thing about modern academics is that modern thought often explains processes while suspending questions of origin. Like, how do you do that? Okay? Culturally, the message becomes, psst, don't infer design. That doesn't logically follow from we don't know, which is what they claim usually about origin. So, we don't know who or what or where the first primitive life form came from, but we know it's not God. How does that logically follow? Okay? So, origin without God, what does it mean? It means something from nothing. Okay? Especially once we involve biological life in the planet Earth. No God means no intelligence needed to create intelligence. Therefore, intelligence from non-intelligence equals something from nothing. So that is what they are implicitly teaching, even if they don't actively say so. However, like I said, then they simultaneously back out of the idea that they are supposedly teaching something from nothing by saying, we don't explain origin. Origin is off limits because it's beyond our scope. I would argue that it's actually beyond humans' ability to comprehend the origin of all things. But that aside, fair enough. If you just say, okay, origin is off limits because it's beyond our scope, we don't explain origin, that's fine. But then they simultaneously will whisper to you, psst, but just don't believe in God. If it wasn't so serious, it would almost be funny because of how blatant it is what they're doing. It certainly doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going on here once you put it all like that. Saying we don't explain origins while also insisting don't infer God is philosophically incoherent unless one admits an extra unstated commitment, which they don't. So that is the very long, in-depth Clayton the Philosopher 4th stream. Hope you enjoyed it all. Everyone, God bless.